You're just living off us. My daughter-in-law said it calmly, right in the middle of dinner, as if she were commenting on the weather. My son didn't look up from his plate. He didn't argue. He didn't stop her. He just kept eating. I stood there for a moment, my hands resting on the back of the chair I'd just pulled out. The roast was still steaming. The table was set with the good plates, the ones I only used when I wanted things to feel like family. No one said another word, so I sat down. I took a bite. I swallowed. Then I quietly excused myself and went upstairs. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and if you feel comfortable, leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to know how far this story reaches. That night had been planned for weeks. Sunday dinner. My idea. I'd even paid for the groceries myself, like I always did. At 71, I still believed that if I kept things warm and familiar, we could stay close. Maybe that was my mistake. The dining room looked exactly the same as it had for years. Same oak table, same framed photos along the wall, birthdays, graduations, one old wedding picture where my husband was still alive and smiling. But something in the air had changed. It felt colder, sharper. Earlier that evening, my daughter-in-law had been unusually polite. She'd asked if I needed help carrying dishes. She'd smiled too much. My son barely spoke. He used to tease me while I cooked, sneaking bites when he thought I wasn't looking. That night, he kept his distance. When she finally said it, "You're just living off us," it landed heavier than shouting ever could, as if I hadn't worked for 40 years. As if the house we were sitting in hadn't been paid off with my paycheck and my husband's overtime, as if I hadn't quietly covered bills more times than I could count. I didn't defend myself. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask what she meant, because I already knew. I walked upstairs to my bedroom and closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands. They looked older than they used to. Thinner. Still steady. Downstairs, I could hear them laughing again. Plates clinking, glasses refilling. The sound of people comfortable in a home they believed belonged to them. Lying on my dresser was a folder I'd nearly forgotten about. Bank statements I hadn't checked in months, mail I'd been meaning to sort through. Things I'd trusted my son to help manage after his father passed. That night I didn't cry. I didn't sleep much either. I opened the folder. And as I turned the pages, something became painfully clear. I wasn't living off them. They had been living off me for a very long time. The house felt different after my husband died. Not louder, not quieter, just hollow. The morning after that dinner, I woke up before sunrise, the way I always had when he was alive. Habit doesn't leave when people do. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, listening. No footsteps, no coughing from the bathroom, no kettle whistling downstairs, just silence, thick and settled. I got up and made coffee for one. The kitchen looked the same, but I moved through it like a guest. Cabinets I'd organized for decades now held groceries I hadn't bought. The fridge was fuller than usual, yet nothing inside felt like it belonged to me. On the counter sat a stack of unopened mail addressed to my son. Not me. Him. Some of it had my name buried in the fine print. After my husband passed, everything shifted quietly. No announcements. No arguments. Just small changes that stacked up day after day. My son started helping with finances. That's how he put it. He said it would be easier for me, less stress. At first, I was grateful. Grief makes you tired in ways sleep can't fix. I let him handle things. Bills, accounts, paperwork. I trusted him because he was my child. Because I raised him to be honest. Because his father would have expected me to. I poured the coffee and sat at the table where we'd eaten dinner the night before. The chair across from me was empty. My husband's chair. No one had moved it yet, but it already felt like it belonged to someone else. I thought about the way my daughter-in-law had said those words. Calm, confident, like she'd rehearsed them. You're just living off us. It replayed in my head, not loud, not angry. Worse, certain. I walked through the house slowly that morning. The hallway closet where my coats used to hang had been rearranged. My winter coat was pushed to the back, new shoes lined up neatly at the front. In the guest room, boxes were stacked against the wall, not labeled, just there. When I asked my son later what they were for, he said, "We're just organizing. Don't worry about it, Mom." Don't worry, that phrase had become common. By mid-morning, I sat down with the folder from the night before. Bank statements, account summaries, pages I hadn't looked at closely since before the funeral. Numbers blurred at first, then they didn't. Withdrawals I didn't recognize, transfers I hadn't approved, monthly expenses listed under categories I never used. Streaming services, travel, dining, things I rarely spent money on anymore. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me. I remembered all the times my daughter-in-law had insisted on paying for dinner, making a show of it. The way my son would say, "We've got this, Mom." I remembered nodding, smiling, letting it go. I wasn't helpless. I hadn't been confused. I'd been trusting. That afternoon, I folded laundry and cleaned the bathroom like any other day. I answered no questions. I said nothing about what I'd seen. Downstairs, life went on as usual. Laughter, phone calls, plans being made without me. But something inside me had shifted. For the first time since my husband died, I didn't feel tired. I felt awake. That evening, I paid closer attention than I ever had before. It wasn't that anyone was acting wildly different. That was the unsettling part. Everything looked normal on the surface. Dinner was casual. The television played softly in the background. My daughter-in-law scrolled through her phone while my son talked about work, his voice relaxed, confident. Too confident. When I asked an innocent question, whether the electric bill had gone up this month, my son answered too quickly, already taken care of. He didn't look at me when he said it. My daughter-in-law chimed in without looking up from her screen. "You don't need to worry about those things anymore. We've got it handled." Handled. Another word I'd started hearing often. I nodded and said nothing. I noticed how she referred to things now. "We pay. We decided. We already talked about it." Somewhere along the way, my house and my money had quietly become ours. Later, when I went to the hallway closet to grab a sweater, I realized something else had changed. The small lockbox where I used to keep important papers was gone. Not forced open, not broken, just missing. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at the empty shelf. When I asked my son about it, he hesitated just a second too long. "Oh, that? I moved it. Safer place. Less clutter." I didn't ask where. That night, after they went to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. Sharper, like it was waiting. I opened my phone and checked the banking app I hadn't used in months. The login information still worked. That surprised me. I scrolled slowly, carefully. Transfers, automatic payments, new linked accounts, a credit card I didn't recognize. The amounts weren't small. Trips I hadn't taken, stores I hadn't visited. Charges made while I was asleep upstairs, believing I was being taken care of. I set the phone down and stared at the dark window across from me. My reflection looked calm. Older? Yes, but clear. The next day, my daughter-in-law suggested we streamline things even more. She mentioned medical paperwork, power of attorney. She said it gently, like she was offering to carry a heavy bag for me. "It's just in case," she said. "You never know." My son nodded. Again, I felt something settle in my chest. Not panic, not fear. Recognition. They weren't worried about me. They were preparing. I thought back to the dinner, to the way she'd said I was living off them. It wasn't an insult. It was a justification. A story they'd told themselves long enough to believe. That afternoon, I went for a walk around the block. Same route I'd walked for years. Same cracked sidewalk. Same mailbox at the corner. But my thoughts moved differently now. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't confused, and I wasn't as alone as they thought. When I came back, my son was on the phone, speaking in low tones. He stopped when he saw me, smiled, asked how my walk was. "Nice," I said. "Clear." And for the first time, I meant more than the weather. Whatever they were planning, I was finally paying attention. That night, I dreamed of my husband. Not the version from the hospital bed, thin and quiet, wires everywhere. I dreamed of him as he was before sickness softened him, standing in the garage with grease on his hands, laughing when something didn't work the first time, telling me more than once, "If anything ever happens to me, everything is yours. Don't let anyone rush you." I woke before dawn with that sentence still clear in my mind. He had always been careful. With money, with promises. When we rewrote our wills years ago, he insisted I be protected first. He'd said it plainly, sitting at the kitchen table where I was sitting now. "The kids will be fine. You're the one who needs security." After he passed, I'd avoided thinking about those conversations. They hurt too much. But now, pieces were sliding back into place. Over breakfast, I opened an old drawer in the study, the one no one ever touched. Inside were folders I hadn't opened since before the funeral. Retirement plans, insurance paperwork, notes in his handwriting, dates circled, instructions written in the margins. Everything he'd promised me was there, everything I hadn't checked. I realized then how quietly I'd stepped aside, how grief had made me agreeable, how easily help had turned into control. Later that morning, my daughter-in-law knocked on my bedroom door. She smiled and asked if I'd slept well. She mentioned a meeting she wanted to schedule. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, she said. Same page, another phrase. She talked about doctors, about emergencies, about being realistic at my age. She said it softly, with concern practiced into every syllable. I listened. I nodded. I thanked her. Inside, I remembered my husband's voice. Steady. Protective. When she left, I sat at the edge of the bed and looked around the room. The dresser my husband had built, the lamp he'd fixed instead of replacing. This wasn't a space I'd borrowed. This was a life I'd built. That afternoon, I drove to the bank alone for the first time in months. No announcements, no arguments, just me and the quiet hum of routine. I asked questions, I requested printouts, I listened carefully. The clerk was polite, efficient. She looked at me with mild surprise when I asked for details instead of summaries. By the time I left, the picture was clear. What had been happening wasn't accidental. It was organized, step by step. Small enough not to alarm me, steady enough to drain me. I sat in my car for a long moment before turning the key. Back at home, dinner was already underway. Laughter floated from the kitchen. Plans for the weekend. A trip mentioned casually as if it were already decided. I joined them at the table. I smiled. I ate. No one noticed anything different. But I did. I saw how comfortable they'd become. How certain. How they spoke as if the future had already been settled. They thought I was slow, distracted, still grieving. They thought wrong. That night I went to bed knowing one thing with absolute clarity. My husband had prepared for this. And so would I. By the 5th day, I stopped reacting altogether. That seemed to unsettle them more than any argument could have. I moved through the house quietly, deliberately. I cooked when I wanted to. I left the room when conversations turned vague. I asked fewer questions and listened more. People reveal plenty when they believe they're no longer being watched. My daughter-in-law began keeping her phone face down. My son started taking calls outside. Small things. Tells. One afternoon, while folding laundry in the living room, I overheard them in the kitchen. They didn't know I was there. She won't notice, my daughter-in-law said. She barely checks anything. My son hesitated. Just make sure it's clean. Clean, not legal, not fair. Clean. I folded the same towel twice, slowly, so my hands wouldn't rush. That evening, I received an email notification on my phone. A banking alert. I hadn't changed any settings, but one had been added. An automatic transfer scheduled for the end of the month. A large one. I didn't confront them. I didn't mention it at dinner. I finished my meal, washed my plate, and went upstairs. In my room, I opened the folder I'd started keeping hidden beneath sweaters. Copies from the bank. Notes I'd written myself. Dates. Amounts. Patterns. This wasn't carelessness. It was strategy. They were positioning me as dependent, making it look like I needed them, building a story where my money quietly became theirs and my role shrank to something manageable. The next morning, my daughter-in-law brought up the idea of downsizing. She said it casually, like it had just occurred to her. "This house is a lot," she said, "for someone your age." My son nodded. "We could help you find something smaller. Easier." I sipped my coffee and looked around the kitchen. The same space where I'd raised a child, where my husband and I had stood shoulder to shoulder through decades of ordinary days. "It is a lot," I said evenly. Relief flickered across her face. She mistook my agreement for surrender. Later that day, I made a phone call of my own. I didn't announce it. I didn't explain myself. I asked questions. I confirmed details. I learned what had been changed and what hadn't. What required my signature. What didn't. The truth was quieter than I expected, and sharper. They hadn't taken everything yet. They were waiting for permission. That night, I lay awake listening to the house settle. Pipes ticking. Floors creaking. Familiar sounds that reminded me this place still knew me. I thought about the way my daughter-in-law watched me now. Measuring. Calculating. I thought about my son's silence and how heavy it had become. In the morning, I placed a small notebook in my purse before leaving the house. Inside were account numbers, names, steps I planned to take. At breakfast, my daughter-in-law asked if I was going out. "Yes," I said, "just handling a few things." She smiled. "Let us know if you need help." I smiled back. "I will," I said, and for the first time the words meant something entirely different. The next few days passed without confrontation, but the tension settled into the house like dust. I noticed how often my daughter-in-law checked the calendar now, how she asked casually when my next doctor's appointment was, how she reminded me more than once where I'd placed my medications as if I might forget. I didn't correct her. My son began offering to drive me everywhere. "No need to strain yourself, Mom," he said it kindly, but he reached for my car keys without asking. I let him. Control doesn't arrive loudly. It comes wrapped in concern. One afternoon, while I was reading in the living room, my daughter-in-law sat across from me with a folder in her hands. She didn't open it right away. She talked about the weather, about groceries, about how busy things had been. Then she slid the folder onto the coffee table. "We were thinking," she said, still smiling, "it might be good to make some things official." Inside were forms, medical directives, authorization pages, places for signatures already marked with yellow tabs. "Just in case," she added. "It would make everything easier." I picked up the papers slowly and skimmed them. The language was polite, neutral, dangerous in its simplicity. I set them back down. "I'll look at these later," I said. Her smile tightened. "There's no rush, but it's better not to wait." That night, I took the folder into my room and read every word carefully. Some documents granted limited authority. Others didn't. A few would have erased my voice entirely if I'd signed them without question. I slept with the light on. The next morning, I went out early, before anyone else was awake. I drove myself. The steering wheel felt steady beneath my hands. At the bank, I updated passwords. At the credit union, I froze one account and separated another. I didn't explain more than necessary. I didn't accuse. I simply acted. When I returned home, my daughter-in-law was waiting in the kitchen. "Where did you go?" she asked, too quickly. "Errands," I said. She glanced toward my purse, then back to my face. "You should tell us when you're heading out, just for safety." I looked at her for a long moment. "I'm still capable," I said evenly. She laughed lightly, as if I'd made a joke. "Of course you are." But she didn't meet my eyes. That evening, my son mentioned finances again. Said we should simplify. Said it would be easier if everything went through one account. "I've already taken care of that," I said. He paused. "Taken care of what?" "Organizing," I replied. "You were right. It's better when things are clear." They exchanged a glance I pretended not to see. Later, alone in my room, I wrote down everything I'd done so far. Every step, every safeguard. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't hiding. I was preparing. I could feel it now. The shift. The moment when their certainty began to crack. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. They were about to learn the difference. By the 7th day, the house no longer felt like a shared space. It felt like a test. Every conversation carried weight. Every glance lingered a second too long. My daughter-in-law watched me closely now, not with warmth but with calculation. My son hovered, uncertain, caught between habit and fear. They knew something had changed. They just didn't know what. That morning, I found my purse moved from where I'd left it. Not hidden, just shifted. A message without words. I opened it calmly and checked inside. Everything was still there. For now. At breakfast, my daughter-in-law spoke first. "We should talk later," she said lightly. "All of us." My son nodded. "About the future." I buttered my toast and took a bite before answering. "All right." The conversation happened that afternoon in the living room. Sunlight came through the windows at an angle that made dust visible in the air. The house looked peaceful. That was the lie of it. They sat across from me on the couch. I stayed in my chair. My daughter-in-law did most of the talking. She always did. She spoke about stress, about responsibility, about how hard things had been for them since my husband passed. "You've been through a lot," she said, "and we just want to make sure you're taken care of." Taken care of. Again, she slid a document across the coffee table. A new one, different from the last. "This would help everyone," she added. "It's temporary." I picked it up and read the first page, then the second. Then I placed it back where it had been. "No," I said. The word landed heavier than I expected. My son frowned. "Mom, I said no, I repeated. Calm, clear. My daughter-in-law's smile disappeared this time, completely. You're being difficult, she said. We're trying to help you. I met her eyes. You're trying to manage me. Silence followed, thick, uncomfortable. My son shifted. We're worried about money, he said finally. You don't really understand how much things cost now. That was when I knew they'd already decided who I was in their story. I stood up slowly. I understand exactly how much things cost, I said. I've been paying for them longer than you've been alive. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I told them I'd be making my own arrangements from now on, that I'd reviewed my accounts, that certain permissions had already been changed. My daughter-in-law's face tightened. Changed how? Carefully, I said. She stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. I nodded. That's what I thought too. That night I packed a small bag, not to leave. Not yet. Just enough to be ready. I slept with my phone beside me and my keys on the nightstand. The next morning, I received a call from the bank confirming a request had been denied. Someone had tried to move money without authorization. I didn't need to ask who. At breakfast, no one spoke. My daughter-in-law didn't look at me. My son stared into his coffee like it might offer answers. I folded my napkin and stood. I won't be controlled, I said quietly. Not in my own home. Not with my own life. No one stopped me as I walked out the door. And for the first time since this began, I knew something else too. They were afraid. The days that followed were quieter, but not calmer. My daughter-in-law stopped pretending. She no longer offered help. No coffee, no polite questions. She moved through the house as if I were already gone, speaking around me instead of to me. My son tried to smooth things over, but his words felt rehearsed, like lines he hoped would keep the peace without choosing a side. I let him talk. I didn't interrupt. Instead, I began changing small routines. I locked my bedroom door at night. I carried my purse with me even inside the house. I placed important papers in a safe deposit box downtown and kept only copies at home. I didn't announce any of it. One afternoon, I returned from the grocery store to find my daughter-in-law in my room. Not cleaning. Searching. She froze when she saw me. I was just looking for extra towels, she said quickly. They're in the hallway closet, I replied. She nodded and left without another word. That evening, my son asked if I planned to stay with a friend for a few days. Just to cool off, he said. I looked at him for a long moment. The boy I'd raised was still there, somewhere beneath the fear and convenience. No, I said. This is my home. The next morning, a letter arrived from a financial services company, addressed to me. Inside was a notice, an attempt to update beneficiary information. Not approved. Flagged. I held the paper steady. They were moving faster now, sloppier. I made another call, then another. I scheduled an appointment with an attorney recommended by someone I trusted, someone who didn't know my son or his wife. At the office, I spoke plainly. I didn't dramatize. I didn't accuse. I presented facts, documents, timelines. The attorney listened carefully, asked precise questions, took notes. You did the right thing by coming in early, she said. Early. The word settled me. When I returned home, the house felt tense. My daughter-in-law was pacing. My son avoided my eyes. At dinner, no one mentioned money, or paperwork, or control. But later that night, I heard them arguing in hushed voices behind their bedroom door. My name came up more than once. I sat on my bed and listened, not with anger but with clarity. This was no longer about misunderstanding. It never had been. They believed they were entitled to my silence, my trust, my life. They were wrong. Before going to sleep, I wrote one sentence in my notebook. I will not be rushed. The next day, I scheduled another meeting. This one would be on my terms. I didn't tell them yet. I didn't need to. Everything was already in motion. The shift became obvious once the money stopped moving. Not dramatically at first, just small signs. A pause before questions, a tightness in voices. My daughter-in-law stopped making plans out loud. My son checked his phone more often, his brow furrowed like something wasn't adding up. I knew exactly what it was. The automatic transfers no longer went through. The shared account sat untouched. The card linked to my funds declined quietly without announcement. No alerts rang in the house, but the silence that followed was louder than anything. At breakfast, my daughter-in-law asked if I'd changed something at the bank. I took my time stirring my oatmeal. I reorganized, I said. She frowned. Reorganized how? Responsibly. My son looked between us. "Mom, we were using that account for household expenses." "I know," I replied. "That's why I closed access." Her chair scraped loudly as she leaned back. "So what are we supposed to do now?" The question surprised me with its honesty. Not why, not did you mean to, just what now. I met her gaze. "Pay your own bills." The room went still. That afternoon, the tone changed completely. My daughter-in-law's concern evaporated. In its place came irritation, sharp comments, heavy sighs. She no longer tried to hide her frustration. My son followed her lead, though less boldly. He asked if I could help out with groceries, if I could cover a utility bill just this once. If I remembered how much things cost these days. "I do," I said each time. "And I also remember how much I've already paid." The requests became complaints. The complaints turned into resentment. That evening, I overheard my daughter-in-law on the phone, pacing the hallway. "She's doing this on purpose," she whispered. "She's making things difficult. Difficult. For protecting myself." Later, my son knocked on my door. He stood there awkwardly, like he used to when he was a teenager and needed money for something he didn't want to explain. "We're under a lot of pressure," he said. "You don't really need all that money sitting there." I looked at him carefully. "It's not sitting," I said. "It's mine." He sighed. "You're being stubborn." "No," I replied. "I'm being careful. There's a difference." That night, I updated my will. It wasn't dramatic. No tears, no anger, just clear decisions made with a steady hand. I removed assumptions. I added conditions. I put protections in place that could not be undone with charm or convenience. The next morning, my daughter-in-law didn't speak to me at all. She slammed cabinets. She spoke loudly on purpose. She wanted me to hear her displeasure. I heard it. I simply didn't absorb it. By the end of the week, they were arguing openly about money, about expectations, about how things had changed. They had. The balance had shifted back where it belonged. I wasn't the quiet background anymore. I wasn't the invisible source. I was present. I was aware. And I was no longer paying for my own erasure. They felt it in every unanswered expectation, and they didn't like it at all. The confrontation didn't arrive with shouting. It came with paperwork. 3 days after I updated my will, a certified letter arrived at the house, addressed to me. My daughter-in-law brought it into the kitchen, her fingers tight around the envelope. "You got mail," she said. Her voice was neutral, but her eyes weren't. I thanked her and opened it slowly at the table. It was a notice from the attorney I'd met with earlier that week. Formal, precise. It confirmed changes I'd requested and outlined boundaries that were now legally documented. I didn't rush. I read it twice. My son hovered nearby, pretending to scroll through his phone. My daughter-in-law stood still, watching my face instead of the paper. "What is it?" my son finally asked. "Confirmation," I said. "Of what?" she pressed. I folded the letter neatly. "Of decisions." Her jaw tightened. "You didn't talk to us about this." "I didn't need to." That was when her composure broke. "So that's it?" she said sharply. "You're cutting us out?" I looked at her. Really looked. The concern she once practiced was gone. What remained was expectation, angry that had been interrupted. "No," I said. "I'm clarifying roles." My son stepped forward. "Mom, you're making this bigger than it needs to be." I met his eyes. "You made it big when you stopped asking." Silence followed. Heavy. Unavoidable. She crossed her arms. "We've done everything for you." I nodded once. "You've done many things without me." That afternoon, I gathered copies of my documents and placed them in a folder. I didn't hide it. I left it on the dining table. They saw it. I could tell by how they moved around it, careful not to touch. Later, my son tried a different approach. He spoke softly, sat across from me, asked if I was angry. "I'm not," I said. "I'm finished pretending." He told me I was being unfair. That family's share. That this wasn't how things were supposed to go. I reminded him of how things had gone. Of the silence. Of the assumptions. Of the words spoken at dinner that night. "You said I was living off you," I said calmly. "That's not something you forget." He looked down. That evening, my daughter-in-law packed a bag and said she was staying with her sister for a few days. She didn't say goodbye. The house felt lighter without her. Before bed, my son knocked on my door. He looked tired. Older. "I didn't think it would turn into this," he said. I believed him. That didn't change anything. "It turned because it was already moving," I replied. He didn't argue. The next morning, I scheduled one final appointment. Not to confront, not to accuse, to finalize. Whatever they had expected from me, silence, confusion, compliance, it ended there. I had drawn the line, and this time, it was written in ink. The final choice came quietly, not with raised voices, not with threats, just a moment where I realized there was nothing left to explain. My son and I sat at the kitchen table the morning after my daughter-in-law left. 2 cups of coffee. No small talk. The house felt unfamiliar, like a place paused between chapters. "She thinks you've gone too far," he said finally. I stirred my coffee once and set the spoon down. "She thought that long before now." He sighed. "She's upset. She says you don't trust us." I looked at him. Trust isn't something you ask for after it's been used up. He didn't respond. I told him about the last appointment I'd scheduled, about the documents that would be finalized, about the boundaries that would no longer be flexible. I didn't threaten. I didn't plead. I informed. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face. For the first time since his father died, he looked unsure of where he stood. "What does this mean for us?" He asked. I considered the question carefully. "It means we start being honest," I said. "Or we don't start at all." He nodded slowly. I couldn't tell if he agreed or if he was simply tired of fighting. That afternoon, I packed a small box. Not essentials, memories, photographs, letters, things that reminded me who I was before I became convenient. I placed the box in my car and drove to a storage unit across town. It felt symbolic, even if I didn't say it out loud. When I returned, my daughter-in-law's sister dropped off more of her things. She didn't come inside. She didn't speak to me. That was fine. By evening, the house was quieter than it had ever been. My son ate dinner alone. I ate in my room. The separation wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate. Before bed, I reviewed my notebook one last time. Every step I'd taken, every safeguard, everything that was now in place. Nothing had been rushed. Nothing had been hidden. The next morning, my attorney called to confirm the final changes were complete. "That's it," she said. "Everything is secured." I thanked her and ended the call. Downstairs, my son was waiting. He looked at me with something I hadn't seen in a while. Respect, maybe. Or realization. "I didn't think you'd follow through," he admitted. I picked up my purse. "I didn't think I'd have to." He stepped aside as I walked past him. At the door, I paused. Not because I was unsure, but because endings deserve acknowledgement. "I love you," I said. "That hasn't changed." He nodded. "I know." But love didn't mean surrender anymore. As I stepped outside, the air felt lighter, clearer, like the first breath after a long confinement. I wasn't walking away from my family. I was walking back to myself. The house settled into a new rhythm after that. Not louder, not happier, just honest. My daughter-in-law never came back to live there. My son stayed, but we existed in separate lanes now, respectful and distant. We spoke when necessary. We didn't pretend. There was grief in that, but there was also relief. I reclaimed the small things first. My chair at the table, my drawer in the kitchen, my morning routine uninterrupted. I stopped asking permission to leave the house. I stopped explaining where I was going. The home felt like mine again, not because anyone said it was, but because I stood in it without shrinking. Weeks passed, then months. The legal work finished quietly, without drama. Accounts settled, boundaries fixed. Everything my husband had worked for was finally secured the way he intended. I visited his grave one afternoon and sat on the bench beside it, the one he used to joke about needing someday. "I figured it out," I told him softly. "Just took me a while." The wind moved through the trees. I stayed until the sun dipped low. My son and I spoke more honestly after that. Not often, not easily, but truth replaced assumption. He apologized once, not fully, not perfectly, but enough to acknowledge the line he'd crossed. I accepted it without reopening the wound. Some things don't need to be relived to be learned. I didn't punish anyone. I didn't demand loyalty. I simply stopped funding disrespect and calling it love. People noticed the change in me. Friends said I looked lighter, straighter, like someone who had finally put something heavy down. They were right. One afternoon, while sorting old boxes in the garage, I found a photo of myself from years ago. Younger, yes, but more importantly, certain. I recognized her immediately. I pinned the photo inside my closet where I could see it every morning. The house still held memories. Some were painful. Some were warm. All of them were mine. I wasn't bitter, I wasn't angry, I was done being invisible. When I think back to that dinner, The words that started everything, I don't feel hurt anymore. I feel clarity. I was never living off them. I was carrying them. And when I finally set the weight down, I stood taller than I had in years. If you've ever felt pushed aside in your own life, if you've ever been told you were a burden when you were the foundation, know this: silence is not weakness. Boundaries are not cruelty. And reclaiming yourself is never too late. Thank you for listening to my story.